The old stagecoach bounced and rattled down the dusty trail, carrying 3 women who had no idea their lives were about to change forever. It was October 1887, and the Wyoming Territory was still wild and rough around the edges. Most folks who lived out here were tough people trying to make something of themselves in a place where the weather could kill you, and your nearest neighbor might be 20 miles away. Martha Henley gripped her worn carpetbag tighter as the coach hit another bump. She was 32 years old, with strong hands that showed she knew how to work. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her dress was practical rather than fancy. Back in Ohio, she had worked her family's farm until her father died, and left her with nothing but debts. The letter from Samuel Pritchard had seemed like a gift from heaven. He owned a general store in Milfield Creek and needed a wife who could help him run it. Sitting across from her was Clara Hoffman, a small woman but built like someone who had never been afraid of hard work. She had fled from Pennsylvania after her husband started drinking too much and using his fists to settle arguments. The bruises had healed during her long journey west, but the fear in her eyes was still there. Jonas Miller had written beautiful letters about his farm and how he dreamed of raising a family. His words had given her hope for the first time in years. The third woman, Rebecca Walsh, was tall and broad-shouldered. She had been a school teacher in Boston before her husband died in a factory accident, leaving her with 2 young children and no way to support them. Her mother-in-law had agreed to care for the children temporarily, while Rebecca traveled west to marry Wade Thompson, a blacksmith who promised a good life and stability. At 35, she felt this might be her last chance at happiness. All 3 women had done what was common in those days. They had hired street artists to paint flattering portraits to send to their future husbands. These artists specialized in making people look younger, prettier, and more delicate than they really were. It was not exactly lying, they told themselves. Everyone did it. The men probably had their own secrets too. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Pete Carlson, had been making this run for 15 years. He had seen plenty of mail-order brides come through, and he knew how these meetings usually went. Sometimes they worked out fine, sometimes they did not. But he had never seen a situation quite like what was waiting in Milfield Creek. "Ladies," Pete called down from his perch, "we will be there in about 10 minutes. You might want to freshen up a bit." Martha pulled out a small mirror and tried to smooth her hair. The journey had been long and dusty, and she knew she did not look her best. But Samuel had written that he valued a woman who could work hard more than one who looked like a china doll. At least that is what she hoped he meant. Clara checked her reflection too. She had brought her best dress, a simple blue cotton that she had sewn herself. It was clean and well made, but it was not the kind of fancy gown that rich ladies wore. Jonas had said he wanted a practical wife, someone who could help build a life on the frontier. Rebecca adjusted her traveling cloak and straightened her shoulders. She had always been taller than most women, and broader too. Her late husband used to say she was built like an Amazon warrior, and he meant it as a compliment. Wade Thompson had written that he needed a strong woman who could handle the challenges of frontier life. As the stagecoach rolled into Milfield Creek, the 3 women got their first look at what would either be their new home or the place where their dreams died. The town was small, maybe 200 people on a good day. There was a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, a boarding house, and a few other businesses. Most of the buildings were made of rough wood that had been weathered gray by the wind and sun. 3 men stood waiting near the general store, and the women knew immediately that these were their intended husbands. Samuel Pritchard was a thin, nervous-looking man in his late 20s. He kept adjusting his spectacles and smoothing his hair. Jonas Miller was older, maybe 40, with the permanently stained hands of someone who worked the soil. Wade Thompson was the biggest of the 3, with arms like tree trunks from years of working iron and steel. The stagecoach came to a stop with a cloud of dust, and Pete climbed down to help the women with their bags. "Good luck, ladies," he said, quietly, and something in his tone made Martha's stomach clench with worry. Samuel stepped forward first, looking eagerly at the 3 women. His face went through a series of changes as he tried to figure out which one was supposed to be his bride. The portrait he had received showed a delicate young woman with soft features and a tiny waist. None of these three women looked anything like that. "Excuse me," Samuel said in a voice that cracked slightly. "I am looking for Miss Martha Henley." Martha stepped forward, her chin raised with determination. "That would be me, Mr. Pritchard. I am pleased to finally meet you." Samuel's face went pale, then red, then pale again. The woman standing before him was not ugly, but she was not the fragile beauty from the portrait. She was solid and practical-looking, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense expression. This was not what he had imagined at all. Jonas Miller approached Clara with similar confusion. He had been expecting someone who looked like a porcelain doll, not this sturdy woman with intelligent eyes and work-worn hands. Clara could see the disappointment in his face, and her heart began to sink. Wade Thompson towered over Rebecca, which was saying something since she was nearly 6 feet tall herself. But where he had expected to find a petite, submissive woman, he found someone who looked like she could probably handle a plow as well as he could. His expression darkened with what looked like anger. The three couples stood there in the dusty street, the silence stretching out uncomfortably. Other townspeople began to gather, sensing drama in the air. Word spread quickly in small towns, and by now everyone knew that the mail-order brides had arrived. "You are not what I expected," Samuel said finally, his voice tight with disappointment. "The portrait you sent was painted by an artist," Martha replied calmly. "Just like yours probably was. People want to look their best when they are trying to make a good impression." But Samuel was not listening. He felt humiliated in front of the whole town. He had bragged about his beautiful bride-to-be, and now everyone could see that he had been fooled. The laughter and whispers from the growing crowd made his cheeks burn with shame. Jonas and Wade were having similar reactions. They felt like they had been tricked, made fools of by women who had deliberately deceived them. The fact that they had probably embellished their own letters and circumstances did not occur to them. They only saw that their romantic fantasies had been crushed by reality. "I think there has been some kind of mistake," Jonas said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "These women are not what they claim to be." Wade said nothing, but his hands were clenched into fists and his face was red with anger. Rebecca took a step back, recognizing the signs of a man who might turn violent. The crowd was growing larger now, and the mood was shifting from curiosity to something uglier. Small towns could be wonderful places to live, but they could also be terrible when they decided to turn against someone, and right now it looked like they were turning against three women who had nowhere else to go. Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, who ran the boarding house, pushed through the crowd. She was a practical woman who had seen enough of life to know that things were rarely as simple as they seemed. "These ladies will need a place to stay while this gets sorted out," she announced. "I have a room available." Samuel turned to her, with a shocked expression. "They are not staying. They can get right back on that stagecoach and go back where they came from." But the stagecoach was already pulling away, and Pete Carlson was not planning to come back for 3 days. The women were stranded, whether the men liked it or not. Martha looked around at the hostile faces surrounding them and felt a cold fear settle in her stomach. This was not going the way she had hoped. None of them had expected to be welcomed with open arms, but they had not expected this level of anger either. As Mrs. Fletcher led them toward the boarding house, Clara whispered, "What are we going to do?" "We are going to figure this out," Martha replied, but her voice lacked conviction. For the first time since leaving Ohio, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Behind them, the three rejected men stood in the street, their humiliation turning to anger. And around them, the people of Milfield Creek began to whisper about fraud and deception, and what should be done about women who would trick honest men. The sun was setting over the Wyoming Territory, painting the sky red and orange. It should have been beautiful, but to Martha, Clara, and Rebecca it felt like a warning of dark times ahead. They had come west looking for new lives and fresh starts. Instead, they had found themselves in a place where their very presence seemed to be considered a crime. None of them could sleep that night. They lay in their shared room at the boarding house, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Outside their window, they could hear men talking in angry voices, and they knew those voices were talking about them. The next morning brought no relief for the three women trapped in Milfield Creek. Martha woke before dawn to the sound of angry voices drifting up from the street below. She crept to the window and peered through the thin curtains, her heart sinking as she saw a small group of men gathered outside the boarding house, pointing up at their window and talking in low, heated tones. Samuel Pritchard had not slept well either. All night long he had tossed and turned, thinking about the snickers and whispers he had heard as he walked home from the stagecoach stop. Billy Henderson from the saloon had slapped him on the back and said, "Well, Sam, looks like you got yourself a real workhorse instead of a show pony." The laughter that followed had burned in his ears for hours. By the time the sun was fully up, Samuel had convinced himself that he was the victim of a deliberate fraud. He marched down to Miller's farm and found Jonas feeding his chickens with sharp, angry movements. Wade Thompson was already there, sitting on the porch and glowering at nothing in particular. "We need to do something about this," Samuel announced without preamble. "Those women made fools of us on purpose." Jonas threw a handful of corn at the chickens with more force than necessary. "They lied to us, plain and simple. Sent us pictures of women who do not even exist." Wade finally spoke up, his voice rough with anger. "Back in Texas, we knew how to deal with people who tried to cheat honest folks." The three men spent the morning working themselves into a fury, each one feeding off the other's anger. They told themselves stories about how the women had probably planned this whole thing, maybe even working together to swindle lonely men out of their money. The fact that none of them had actually lost any money did not seem to matter. By noon, they had decided to take their complaints to the most respected people in town. Their first stop was the church, where they found preacher Ezekiel Crenshaw preparing his sermon for the upcoming Sunday service. Crenshaw was a tall, thin man with burning eyes who believed that the frontier was a testing ground, where God separated the righteous from the wicked. "Preacher," Samuel began, wringing his hat in his hands, "we have got a problem that threatens the moral foundation of our community." Crenshaw set down his Bible and listened with growing concern as the three men told their story. But the version they told was not quite the truth. In their telling, the women had deliberately set out to deceive them, sending false pictures and lying about their backgrounds. They painted themselves as innocent victims of a calculated scheme. "These women represent everything that is wrong with the modern world," Crenshaw declared when they finished. "They have no respect for the sacred institution of marriage or the honest trust between a man and a woman. They see our men as nothing more than tools to be used for their own selfish purposes." The preacher's words gave the men's anger a sense of righteousness. They were not just disappointed suitors now. They were defenders of moral order. Their next stop was the home of Mrs. Constance Hartwell, the town's unofficial guardian of proper behavior. Constance was a widow who had lost her husband in an Indian raid 5 years earlier. Since then, she had appointed herself the keeper of community standards, organizing church socials and making sure that everyone behaved according to her strict interpretation of Christian values. Constance listened to their story with pursed lips and narrowed eyes. "I suspected something was wrong the moment I saw those women," she said with satisfaction. "They have a bold, shameless look about them, not at all like proper ladies should be." By afternoon, word had spread throughout the small town. But as the story passed from person to person, it grew and changed like a plant in fertile soil. What had started as disappointment over mismatched expectations became a tale of deliberate fraud and moral corruption. At Murphy's saloon, the story was that the women were professional swindlers who traveled from town to town, tricking honest men out of their money and then disappearing in the night. At the general store, people whispered that the women were probably running from the law back east, using false identities to hide their criminal pasts. The women themselves knew nothing of these growing stories. They spent the day in their room, at the boarding house, too afraid to venture out into the hostile atmosphere they could feel building around them. Mrs. Fletcher brought them meals and warned them to stay inside. "The mood in this town is getting ugly," she told them quietly. "People are saying things that do not make much sense, but they are saying them loud and angry." That afternoon, Martha tried to approach Samuel at his store to talk reasonably about the situation. She knocked on the door and waited, but when Samuel saw her through the window, he turned away and pretended not to notice. When she knocked again, he called out, "Store's closed." Clara had no better luck when she tried to find Jonas. She walked out to his farm, hoping to explain that she had never meant to deceive anyone, but Jonas saw her coming down the road and met her at his gate with a shotgun across his arm. "You are not welcome here," he said coldly. "I suggest you head back to town before people start thinking you are trespassing." Rebecca did not even try to approach Wade. She had seen the look in his eyes the day before, and she recognized the signs of a man who might solve his problems with violence. She had learned to read those signs during her first marriage. As evening approached, the situation grew worse. Preacher Crenshaw announced that there would be a special meeting at the church after supper to discuss the moral crisis facing their community. Mrs. Hartwell organized a group of women to spread the word, making sure that everyone understood the gravity of the situation. The meeting filled the small church to capacity. Families who rarely attended Sunday services showed up, drawn by the promise of drama and righteous anger. Crenshaw stood at the pulpit like an Old Testament prophet, his voice rising and falling as he spoke about the corruption that had invaded their peaceful community. "We have welcomed serpents into our garden," he declared, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "These women came here not seeking honest marriage, but planning to deceive and corrupt our men. They mock the sacred bonds of matrimony and make a mockery of the trust that holds our community together." The crowd murmured agreement, their faces growing harder with each word. Samuel, Jonas, and Wade sat in the front row, nodding along with every accusation. They had become heroes in their own story, brave defenders of truth standing against the forces of deception. Mrs. Hartwell stood up when the preacher finished. "I have lived in this community for 20 years, she announced, "and I have never seen such a brazen assault on our values. These women have shown that they will stop at nothing to get what they want, regardless of who they hurt in the process." An older man named Henry Caldwell raised his hand. "What exactly are we supposed to do about it? They have not broken any actual laws." "Some things are more important than man's law," Crenshaw replied ominously. "Sometimes God calls us to take action when the proper authorities fail to protect the innocent." The meaning of his words was clear to everyone in the room. The crowd began to mutter about justice and making examples and showing other potential deceivers that Milfield Creek was not a place where honest folks could be taken advantage of. Young Tom Fletcher, Mrs. Fletcher's son, tried to speak up for the women. "Maybe we should hear their side of the story before we decide they are criminals," he suggested. "My mother says they seem like decent enough people who just wanted a chance at a new life." But his voice was drowned out by angry shouts and accusations that he was being fooled by the women's false charms. Someone called him naive, and someone else suggested that maybe he was in on the scheme somehow. As the meeting broke up, small groups formed on the church steps, their conversations growing more heated and more dangerous. The rejected suitors found themselves surrounded by supporters who assured them that they had every right to be angry and that something needed to be done. Back at the boarding house, the three women huddled together in their room, listening to the sounds of the angry crowd dispersing into the night. They could hear men's voices calling out promises of justice and retribution, and they knew that those voices were talking about them. Martha sat by the window, watching the shapes moving in the darkness below. "I think we might be in real trouble," she said quietly. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, remembering the feel of her husband's fists when he was angry. "Maybe we should try to leave. Walk to the next town or something." But Rebecca shook her head. "It is 20 miles to the nearest settlement, and we do not have supplies for that kind of journey. Besides, they would probably come after us." The three women spent another sleepless night, taking turns watching the window and listening for sounds of approaching danger. Outside, Milfield Creek settled into an uneasy quiet, but they all knew it was the kind of quiet that came before a storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and greater dangers. The town had made up its mind that the women were criminals who deserved punishment, and in a place where the nearest law was 100 miles away, the people of Milfield Creek were preparing to take justice into their own hands. The third day dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like a bad omen. Martha woke to the sound of hammering coming from somewhere in town, a steady rhythmic pounding that filled her with dread, even though she could not say why. When she looked out the window, she saw more men than usual moving through the streets, all of them walking with the kind of purpose that meant trouble. Mrs. Fletcher came up to their room earlier than usual, carrying a tray with bread and coffee, but wearing an expression that made the women's stomachs clench with fear. "You ladies need to know what is happening," she said without preamble. "There is talk in town about holding some kind of trial. People are saying you committed crimes and need to face justice." Clara's cup rattled against its saucer as her hands began to shake. "What crimes? We have not done anything wrong, Mrs. Fletcher sat down heavily in the room's single chair. "Logic does not seem to matter much right now. The whole town has worked itself into a frenzy, and they are looking for someone to blame for, well, for everything that is wrong with their lives, I suppose." Rebecca stood by the window, watching the men moving through the streets below. "How many people are we talking about?" "Most of the town," Mrs. Fletcher admitted. "There are a few, folks who think this has gone too far, but they are keeping their mouths shut. Nobody wants to be seen as defending you against the rest of the community." The hammering sound grew louder, and Martha finally had to ask what it was. Mrs. Fletcher's face went pale. "They are building a platform in the town square," she said quietly, "for the trial." The women looked at each other with growing horror. A trial meant they would at least get a chance to defend themselves, but the tone in Mrs. Fletcher's voice suggested that this would not be the kind of trial where innocence mattered much. Around mid-morning, a group of men arrived at the boarding house. Samuel Pritchard was there, along with Jonas Miller and Wade Thompson, but they were joined by a dozen other townsmen who looked like they meant business. Preacher Crenshaw stood at the front of the group, holding a Bible in one hand, and what looked like a list of charges in the other. "Ladies," Crenshaw called up to their window, "you are required to appear before a tribunal of your peers to answer for your crimes against this community. You have 10 minutes to prepare yourselves." Martha tried to argue through the window. "We have not committed any crimes. We came here in good faith hoping to build new lives." "Your good faith will be judged by honest people," Crenshaw replied coldly. "Not by the people who practice the deception. There was no choice but to go with them." Mrs. Fletcher whispered a quick prayer and squeezed each woman's hand as they walked past her. "God help you," she murmured, and the words did not sound very hopeful. The town square had been transformed into something that looked like a courtroom from a nightmare. The platform that had been built that morning stood about 3 feet high with a single chair in the center that was clearly meant for the accused. Benches had been arranged in rows facing the platform, and they were already filled with nearly every adult in Milfield Creek. The mood of the crowd was ugly and eager, like people who had come to watch a hanging rather than a trial. Children had been kept away, but the adults sat with hard faces and crossed arms, already convinced of the women's guilt before a single word had been spoken. Preacher Crenshaw climbed onto the platform and raised his Bible above his head. "We are gathered here today to seek justice for the crimes committed against our community," he announced in his booming preacher's voice. "We shall hear the evidence and render a verdict according to the law of God and the judgment of righteous people." There was no lawyer for the women, no one to speak in their defense except themselves. The crowd had appointed itself as both judge and jury, with Crenshaw serving as prosecutor and Constance Hartwell sitting at a small table to record the proceedings. Samuel Pritchard was called forward first to present his case. He stood on the platform, turning to face the crowd like an actor playing to an audience. "I am a simple, honest man," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I work hard, I pay my bills, and I try to live according to Christian principles. When I decided to seek a wife through correspondence, I did so with the purest of intentions." The crowd murmured approval, and Samuel gained confidence. "I was seeking a partner in life, someone to share the burdens and joys of building a future together. Instead, I was sent a woman who deliberately misrepresented herself, using false images and deceptive words to trick me into paying for her passage west. Martha tried to interrupt, but Crenshaw banged a gavel on a wooden block and declared that she would have her chance to speak later. Samuel continued his testimony, painting himself as an innocent victim of a carefully planned deception. He claimed that Martha had sent him a portrait that bore no resemblance to her actual appearance, and that her letters had implied she was a delicate, refined lady rather than the coarse masculine creature who had stepped off the stagecoach. Jonas. Miller's testimony was similar, though he added claims that Clara had lied about her background and experience. He said her letters had suggested she was an innocent young woman who had lived a sheltered life, when in reality she was clearly someone who had been used hard by life and left rough around the edges. Wade Thompson's accusations were the harshest. He stood before the crowd like a man delivering a sermon about sin and corruption, his voice rising as he described how Rebecca had deceived him about her very nature as a woman. He claimed that her letters had promised a submissive, obedient wife, when anyone could see that she was a mannish creature who probably sought to dominate and control any man foolish enough to marry her. When the three men finished their testimony, Preacher Crenshaw called for other witnesses. Several townspeople stood up to speak, though none of them had any direct knowledge of the correspondence or the women's actual intentions. Instead, they spoke about the danger of allowing deceptive women to corrupt their community and the need to send a strong message to other potential swindlers. Mrs. Hartwell rose to address the crowd, her voice shaking with righteous anger. "I have seen the damage that immoral women can do to a God-fearing community," she declared. "They come in like wolves dressed as sheep, using their feminine wiles to deceive honest men and corrupt the sacred bonds that hold our society together." Finally, Crenshaw called Martha forward to defend herself. She climbed onto the platform on unsteady legs, looking out at a sea of hostile faces. Every person in that crowd had already decided she was guilty. She could see it in their eyes. "I never meant to deceive anyone," she began, her voice barely audible above the wind that was picking up as the storm clouds moved closer. "The portrait I sent was painted by an artist in Cincinnati. He said it was common practice to make people look their best in such pictures." "So you admit to sending a false image?" Crenshaw interrupted triumphantly. "I sent a flattering image," Martha replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just like anyone would do when trying to make a good impression. I never claimed to be something I was not. My letters were honest about my background and my willingness to work hard." But the crowd was not interested in her explanations. They had already heard what they wanted to hear, and her attempts to defend herself only seemed to make them angrier. Clara's testimony was even more difficult to watch. She broke down completely, admitting through her tears that she had fled from an abusive marriage and was desperately seeking safety and a new start. Instead of generating sympathy, her confession seemed to confirm the crowd's worst suspicions about her character. "So you admit that you are a runaway wife," Crenshaw shouted. "You have abandoned your sacred vows and seek to deceive another man into taking on damaged goods." Rebecca tried to maintain her dignity as she spoke, explaining that she was a widow seeking to support her children and build a stable life. But when she revealed that she had left her children behind with relatives, the crowd erupted in angry shouts about unnatural mothers and women who abandon their sacred duties. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as the testimonies ended. Thunder rolled across the sky and the first fat raindrops began to fall. But the crowd seemed energized by the dramatic weather, as if nature itself was supporting their cause. Crenshaw did not bother with lengthy deliberations. He conferred briefly with Mrs. Hartwell and a few other leading citizens, then stood to deliver the verdict. "We find these women guilty of fraud, deception, and crimes against the moral order of our community," he announced, his voice carrying easily over the rumbling thunder. "They came here not seeking honest marriage, but planning to deceive and corrupt our men. They have shown themselves to be unfit for Christian society." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, finally getting the justice they had been craving. But Crenshaw was not finished. The penalty for such crimes, in the absence of proper legal authority, must be severe enough to serve as a warning to others who might attempt such deception. These women have forfeited their right to live among decent people. Martha felt her legs give out beneath her as the meaning of his words became clear. They were not just being banished from the town. They were being sentenced to death. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the air clean and cold. Martha, Clara, and Rebecca had not slept at all. They sat together on the narrow bed, watching the first pale light of dawn creep through the window, and knowing it might be the last sunrise they would ever see. Outside they could hear the sounds of the town waking up, voices calling to each other with an excitement that made their blood run cold. Mrs. Fletcher had tried to bring them breakfast, but none of them could eat. Their mouths were too dry with fear, and their stomachs were twisted into knots. The older woman sat with them for a while, not saying much, just offering what comfort she could with her presence. "I sent word to the county sheriff yesterday," she whispered, glancing toward the door to make sure no one was listening. "But he is 3 days' ride away, and I do not think help will come in time." Through the window they could see men gathering in the town square. Someone had built a fire, and the smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from below. It seemed horrible that people could think about breakfast while preparing to watch 3 women die. At exactly 7 o'clock, Preacher Crenshaw arrived with a group of men to escort the women to their fate. He carried his Bible and wore the black coat he saved for funerals, as if this was some kind of holy ceremony rather than cold-blooded murder. "Ladies," he said formally, "it is time." The women rose on shaking legs and walked toward the door. Mrs. Fletcher squeezed each of their hands as they passed, whispering prayers under her breath. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she did not try to stop what was happening. She knew it would only get her killed too. The town square was packed with people, more than Martha had ever seen in one place since arriving in Milfield Creek. It seemed like every man, woman, and older child in the territory had come to witness the execution. They stood in a rough circle around the old oak tree, talking in excited whispers and pointing at the 3 nooses that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Samuel, Jonas, and Wade stood near the front of the crowd, their faces hard with satisfaction. They had gotten their justice, and soon the whole territory would know that Milfield Creek was not a place where honest men could be fooled by deceitful women. Preacher Crenshaw climbed onto a wooden box so everyone could see him clearly. He opened his Bible and began to read from the Old Testament, choosing passages about divine justice and the punishment of sinners. His voice carried across the square, rising and falling with practiced rhythm. "The Lord sees all deception," he declared, his eyes fixed on the 3 women who stood surrounded by armed guards. "And he demands that justice be done, even when earthly authorities fail to act." The crowd murmured agreement, their faces showing the kind of righteous satisfaction that comes from believing you are doing God's work. Children who had been brought to watch stood wide-eyed beside their parents, learning lessons about justice and morality that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Martha tried to speak, to make one last appeal for reason and mercy, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The crowd was not interested in hearing from the condemned anyway. They had already heard everything they needed to hear. Just as Crenshaw was preparing to signal for the executions to begin, a new sound cut through the morning air. It started as a distant rumble, like thunder, but it grew steadily louder and more distinct. Hoofbeats, many of them coming fast. The crowd turned toward the sound, their excited chatter dying away as they tried to figure out what was happening. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the town. Someone was coming, and they were in a hurry. Samuel Pritchard felt the first stirring of unease in his stomach. Who would be riding this hard so early in the morning? He asked no one in particular. The answer came as a dozen riders thundered into the town square, their horses lathered with sweat and breathing hard from a long, fast ride. At the head of the group rode a man that everyone in the territory knew by reputation, even if they had never met him personally. James McKenna was 62 years old, with silver hair and a beard that had been white for more than a decade. He sat his horse like a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, straight-backed and alert despite his age. His ranch was the largest in 3 counties, and his word carried more weight than any sheriff or judge in the territory. McKenna had fought in the Civil War as a young man serving under General Grant and seeing enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. After the war, he had come west with nothing but his horse and his rifle, building his ranch through hard work, fair dealing, and an absolute refusal to back down from what he knew was right. The riders behind him were his most trusted hands, men who had worked for him for years and would follow him into hell if he asked them to. They were all armed, and they all wore the grim expressions of men who had come to stop something terrible from happening. McKenna rode his horse straight into the center of the crowd, which parted before him like water. He stopped directly between the three condemned women and the hanging tree, his pale blue eyes sweeping over the assembled townspeople with obvious disgust. "What in the name of God is going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. Preacher Crenshaw stepped forward, clutching his Bible like a shield. "Mr. McKenna, we are carrying out justice for crimes committed against our community. These women have been tried and found guilty of fraud and deception." McKenna's expression grew even colder. "Tried by who? I do not see a judge here or a sheriff or anyone else with the legal authority to try anyone for anything." "We are the people of this community," Crenshaw replied, his voice rising with righteous anger. "When legal authority fails to protect the innocent, God calls upon righteous men to act." "Righteous men?" McKenna's voice cracked like a whip. "I see a mob preparing to murder 3 women whose only crime was failing to meet your ridiculous expectations." The crowd stirred uneasily. McKenna's reputation gave his words a weight that could not be ignored, even by people who were convinced of their own righteousness. Several townspeople began to look uncertain, as if they were seeing their actions through different eyes for the first time. Samuel Pritchard found his voice, though it came out higher and shakier than he intended. "Mr. McKenna, these women deliberately deceived us. They sent false pictures and lied about who they were. We have been made fools of in front of the whole territory." McKenna turned his cold gaze on the young shopkeeper. "So you were disappointed by reality? That gives you the right to commit murder?" "It is not murder," Wade Thompson shouted from the crowd. "It is justice for crimes against honest men." McKenna's horse danced sideways as he turned to face the blacksmith. "What crimes exactly? Did they steal money from you? Did they rob your stores or burn your crops? Or did they simply fail to live up to the fantasy you had built in your head?" Jonas Miller stepped forward, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "They lied to us. They sent pictures that made them look like different people entirely." "And you, of course, were completely honest in your own letters," McKenna replied dryly. "You told them exactly how much money you have saved, described your property accurately, and admitted to any personal faults or failures." The silence that followed was telling. Everyone in the crowd knew that the men had probably exaggerated their own situations just as much as the women had flattered their portraits. McKenna climbed down from his horse and walked toward the 3 condemned women. Up close, he could see the terror in their eyes, but also a dignity that impressed him. These were not hardened criminals or dangerous schemers. They were frightened women who had made the mistake of seeking better lives in a place where disappointment could be deadly. "What are your names?" he asked gently, his voice completely different from the harsh tone he had used with the crowd. "Martha Henley," the first woman replied, her voice barely audible. "Clara Hoffman," said the second. "Rebecca Walsh," whispered the third. McKenna nodded and turned back to face the crowd. "I have spent 40 years in this territory," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "I have seen real criminals and real crimes. I have seen men who deserved hanging and women who deserved punishment. These 3 ladies are not criminals." Preacher Crenshaw raised his Bible higher. "They have violated the sacred trust of marriage. They have mocked the holy bonds that hold Christian society together." "They have violated nothing," McKenna shot back. "They answered advertisements from lonely men, sent the best pictures they could manage, and traveled hundreds of miles hoping to build new lives. The fact that they did not match your fairy tale expectations does not make them criminals." "Misk." Hartwell stood up from her place in the crowd. "Mr. McKenna, you do not understand the situation. These women represent a threat to the moral foundation of our community. If we allow such deception to go unpunished, what message does that send to other women who might try the same thing? McKenna's laugh was harsh and bitter. What it sends, ma'am, is the message that people in this territory are judged by their actions, not by whether they look like paintings done by street artists trying to make a living. The crowd was growing restless, some people beginning to mutter among themselves. The ride to McKenna's ranch took most of the day, but for Martha, Clara, and Rebecca it felt like a journey from one world to another. Behind them lay Milfield Creek, where they had nearly lost their lives for the crime of being different than expected. Ahead lay the unknown, but for the first time in days the unknown felt hopeful rather than terrifying. James McKenna rode beside them in comfortable silence for the first few miles, giving them time to recover from their ordeal. His men spread out around them like protective guards, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. But McKenna was confident that the people of Milfield Creek would not follow them. The mob had lost its courage when faced with real opposition. As they traveled deeper into the open country, the landscape began to change. The scrubby hills around Milfield Creek gave way to rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon. Cattle dotted the pastures, fat and healthy-looking, and the women could see that this was a well-run operation built by someone who understood the land and respected it. "Tell me about yourselves," McKenna said finally, his voice gentle and encouraging. "I would like to know who I am helping." Martha spoke first, her voice growing stronger as she realized that this man genuinely wanted to listen. She told him about her family's farm in Ohio, how she had worked alongside her father and brothers until his death left her with nothing but debts. She explained how Samuel Pritchard's letters had seemed like a lifeline, offering a chance to use her skills in a new place where hard work was valued. "I never meant to deceive anyone," she said earnestly. "The portrait was painted to look nice, but I was honest about everything else. I can cook, clean, manage accounts, and work in the fields if needed. I just wanted a chance to build something worthwhile." Clara's story was harder to tell, but McKenna listened without judgment as she described her abusive marriage and desperate flight to Wyoming. "I thought if I could start over somewhere new, maybe I could find some peace," she said quietly. "I know I am not much to look at, but I can sew, manage a household, and I am not afraid of hard work." Rebecca's tale of widowhood and the children she had left behind brought tears to her eyes, but McKenna's steady presence gave her the courage to continue. "I was a school teacher before I married," she explained. "I can read and write better than most, and I understand figures. I thought I could help with record keeping or teach the local children. I just needed a chance to prove myself." McKenna listened to each story with the attention it deserved, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, considering what he had heard. "Ladies," he said finally, "it sounds to me like you are exactly the kind of people this territory needs. We have plenty of dreamers and schemers out here, but not nearly enough folks who understand the value of honest work and practical skills." As the sun began to set, they created a hill and saw McKenna's ranch spread out below them. It was impressive in its simple functionality: a large main house built of stone and timber, several barns and outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and bunkhouses for the workers. Everything was well maintained and purposeful, speaking of prosperity built through years of careful management. "Welcome to the Iron Creek Ranch," McKenna said with obvious pride. "It is not fancy, but it is honest work and good living for people who are willing to earn it." Word of their arrival had spread ahead of them, and several people came out to greet the newcomers. McKenna's housekeeper, Anna Rodriguez, was a motherly woman in her 50s who took one look at the exhausted women and immediately began organizing food and comfortable places for them to rest. "Mr. James," she scolded in accented English, "these ladies look like they have been through hell. Get them inside where it is warm and I will make something good to eat." Over the next few days, the three women began to understand what real hospitality looked like. They were given comfortable rooms in the main house and invited to join the family meals. McKenna treated them not as charity cases or servants, but as welcomed guests who would soon become valuable members of his operation. Martha proved her worth almost immediately. Ana Rodriguez was getting older and found it harder to manage the cooking for 20 ranch hands by herself. Martha stepped in naturally, organizing the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding farm hands her whole life. Within a week, she was producing meals that had the cowboys asking for seconds and thirds. Clara discovered that her sewing skills were desperately needed. Ranch work was hard on clothes, and most of the men had been making do with poorly mended gear for months. She set up a work area in one of the spare rooms and began the seemingly endless task of keeping everyone properly equipped. But she also found time to make small improvements: curtains for the windows, tablecloths for the dining room, and other touches that made the ranch feel more like a home. Rebecca's education made her invaluable in ways she had not expected. McKenna had been struggling to keep proper records of his business operations, and Rebecca quickly organized a system that tracked everything from cattle births to feed expenses. But her greatest contribution came when she noticed that several of the younger ranch hands could barely read or write. "Would you mind if I started some evening classes?" she asked McKenna during their second week. "Some of your men could benefit from basic education, and I miss teaching." McKenna's face lit up with approval. "That is exactly the kind of thinking this place needs. Education is the foundation of everything else." The evening classes became popular quickly. Men who had worked all day in the saddle would gather in the main room after supper, laboriously copying letters and practicing simple arithmetic. Rebecca was patient and encouraging, never making anyone feel stupid for their lack of schooling. As autumn turned to winter, the women settled into their new lives with a contentment they had never expected to find. They were no longer seeking husbands or depending on others for their survival. Instead, they had become independent, valuable members of a community that respected them for their contributions. The story of what had happened in Milfield Creek spread throughout the territory, but the version that people heard was different from what the mob had intended. Instead of serving as a warning to other deceptive women, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mob justice and unrealistic expectations. Martha's relationship with Tom Rodriguez, Anna's nephew and McKenna's foreman, developed slowly and naturally. Tom was a widower in his 40s who valued practical skills and good character over appearances. Their courtship was based on mutual respect and shared values, exactly the kind of partnership Martha had always hoped to find. Clara never remarried, but she found something more valuable than a husband: genuine peace and security. Her sewing business grew to serve the entire region, and she saved enough money to bring her sister West to join her. Together, they built a life that was entirely their own, free from the fear that had dominated Clara's past. Rebecca's greatest joy came when she was finally able to send for her children. Her son and daughter arrived on the spring stagecoach, wide-eyed and excited to see their new home. The ranch community welcomed them warmly, and Rebecca realized that she had found something better than the marriage she had originally sought: a place where she could raise her children with dignity and hope. McKenna watched it all with satisfaction, knowing that his intervention had saved not just 3 lives, but had also enriched his community in ways he had never anticipated. The ranch was more prosperous and pleasant than it had ever been, and he often said that the best investment he had ever made was giving 3 good women a chance to prove their worth. The people of Milfield Creek had to live with the knowledge of what they had almost done. Some of them, like Mrs. Fletcher and her son Tom, spoke out against what had happened and worked to ensure that nothing like it ever occurred again. Others, including Preacher Crenshaw and Mrs. Hartwell, refused to admit that they had been wrong and continued to insist that they had been defending moral standards. Samuel, Jonas, and Wade found that their reputations had been damaged by the incident. Word spread that they were the kind of men who would rather see women hanged than admit their own unrealistic expectations. None of them ever found wives through correspondence again, and all 3 eventually left the territory to start over, somewhere else. Years later, when people told the story of the Milfield Creek incident, they focused on the lesson it taught about judging people by their character rather than their appearance. Martha, Clara, and Rebecca had come west seeking new lives, and despite nearly losing everything, they had found something better than they had ever dreamed possible. The mail-order bride business continued throughout the territory, but with a new understanding that both men and women needed to approach such arrangements with realistic expectations and honest communication. The tragedy that had almost occurred served as a reminder that the frontier was a place where people should be valued for their contributions, not condemned for failing to match impossible standards. On quiet evenings at the Iron Creek Ranch, when the work was done and the family gathered around the dinner table, Martha, Clara, and Rebecca would sometimes think about how close they had come to dying in that dusty town square.